Hello, I'm Yonason Goldson, inviting you to join us, now that you're already here, I hope, to Grappling with the Gray, the first live stream, the first panel, in what I hope will be a long and engaging series. I have three of my trusted advisors, trusted consultants with us today. We have Dave Bricker, who's a speaker, presentation coach, and business storytelling expert. We have Deb Brown-Marr, who is a sales expert and author of Sell Like Jesus. She equips others to sell and serve their customers with integrity and without compromise. And we have Mark O'Brien, who's a writer, columnist, and skeptic. If I remember correctly, Irma Bombeck said, the grass is always greener over the skeptic tank. Although maybe that's not exactly what she said. In any case, he is the founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, as well as co-founder and president of Source Consulting Services. So welcome, Dave, welcome, Deb, welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Yonason.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And we're going to jump right into our ethical scenario or dilemma for today. In July 1977, a lightning strike in Westchester County set off a power outage that plunged New York City into 25 hours of darkness. Flights were canceled, baseball games suspended, and subway trains ground to a halt. Looting spread through neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the Bronx, along with hundreds of fires started by arsonists. Imagine that you were walking from your office in Brooklyn to catch the subway home when the lights went out. Within moments, you hear the sounds of shattering glass and you see flames rising into the sky. A taxi pulls up beside you and the cabbie yells, "You want to get out of here?" It's a $30 ride home, but you consider it a bargain. As you climb in, the driver says, "For $100, I'll take you anywhere you want to go." The crowd seem to be growing more unruly by the moment. "All right," you say, "whatever you want." When the cabbie pulls up in front of your house, you say, "Listen, I'll pay the regular fare and I'll even give you a tip, but I'm not paying you $100. That's extortion." "A deal's a deal," the cabbie replies. "You agree to the price, you have to pay." Who's right? The floor is open.
I want to say that one of your suggestions was to use our intuition to argue a position that might have been the opposite of what we first thought. And I have to admit, I didn't find any room for intuition because while Judge Judy would probably insist that there's no such thing as a verbal contract, the passenger agreed to the price as he got in. So at least my initial take is that the taxi driver was right.
And I would have to agree. And then I thought, what if the taxi driver really was extorting and the passenger did their own little bit of extortion in return? Did the passenger have the right to accept the ride and then deny the price? So that was a little bit underhanded, but if you look at it from the standard price of $30 for that ride, did they perhaps have the right?
And I kind of feel, and this somewhat follows what Deb is saying, I kind of feel like they were both in the wrong. Of course, the taxi driver is clearly wrong to overcharge for something that has a certain market value. He's leveraging that emergency. Once you agree to those terms, you can agree to them. Of course, nobody's walking around with $100 cash. Cash is hardly even exists anymore. So essentially, you have a record that you paid that. You can always tell the taxi driver, I'm paying you, but I will have a receipt on my credit card and I will be filing a complaint. and he can then weigh the impact on him. Or you could even, for example, file some sort of a suit based on the usury laws. But I think when we attempt to kind of be a vigilante or steal back our own money, then it's a case of two wrongs trying to make a right.
My sense is that, and Deb, you actually have me thinking. But in 1977, I think significantly more people were using cash than are likely to be using cash today. Dave, I do take your point though. I just don't carry cash. I just don't. But in 1977, I'm quite sure I did. The notion, Deb, of the passenger taking the driver hostage is interesting to me. I don't know that I'd necessarily characterize it as hostage taking, and obviously enough, we don't have the privilege of knowing what their intents were. But the passenger could have been thinking, I'm going to accept this $100 at face value to get out of here, and then when I get home, I'll deal with the consequences then, but I'm going to refuse to pay this guy. And I also wonder, Dave, if market conditions don't sort of determine what the market will bear, regardless of how we might define value. Mm-hmm. If I'm in some strange neighborhood, the place is on fire, there's people running around with guns or whatever they're running around with, and I want out, that $30 ride just went up in value for me.
And I agree with you, Mark. I think at issue for me would be like accepting the deal on the merits that you get to survive, and then changing the deal later. Now you have somebody who's a crook kind of lowering the passenger's moral standard. And I think I would be inclined to say, I think I'm going to pay you the $100 I agreed. I don't think it's fair. And then ultimately, that person has to go on with their life looking over their shoulder. I'll be glad to have gotten out. I'll nurse my financial wounds and I'll recover. It's not like he asked me for $10,000 or $1 million. Maybe the principle's the same. At a certain point, you're going to decline the ride and walk. But I think that when we get involved with trying to discipline the people who take advantage of us, we often walk in the wrong direction while we do that.
You know, there are a couple of issues that just come up here. One is really maybe a starting point. We could take a step back. Is what the cabbie doing wrong? Is it market value? If it's just market value, then he's not doing anything wrong. And if he's not doing anything wrong, then there's absolutely no defense for the passenger to not pay him his fee. On the other hand, if he is doing something wrong, what exactly is it? I know there used to be, I don't know if there still are, there used to be scalping laws. You couldn't take tickets to a popular event. You weren't allowed to resell them at a higher price. Well, why not? Why isn't that like any other investment? And if it is different, would that apply here? Or would it not?
So I have quite a bit of experience using cabs in Chicago, not New York. So I don't know if it's different, but in Chicago, there are certain rates that are regulated, and a cabbie can only charge so much between one city and another. And going from O'Hare to where my hotel was $30, period. And there was no way to fluctuate that. It didn't matter how long it took. I took a number of drives in snow, took twice as long, he got the same price. So if that rule were in effect in New York City, then the cabbie was wrong asking for a higher price. he was taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah. A cab
If-
driver, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, if there is no such stipulation, then he was perfectly within his rights, I assume, as far as the law goes. But was he being nice, charging $100 for a $30 fare?
And so the difference between what's legal and what's ethical is one of the fundamental topics that comes up in these kinds of discussions. Dave, do you have something?
Well, I'm just thinking that usually, let's say it's yellow cab or checker cab, the driver is either an employee or a subcontractor of a company, and that company publishes certain rates and standards. So that person is really failing to represent their employer or sponsor in an ethical way. So you could argue that. Of course, if there's 1,000 people trying to get out of the city and there's an incredible supply and demand situation, I can see where the cab driver would be tempted to take advantage of the situation. However, you're misrepresenting the offering of somebody who's paid you to represent that accurately. I think that's unethical, even under those dire circumstances.
Well, I didn't quite catch that last point, Dave. Could you rephrase that?
Well,
Last point you made?
if I'm driving a cab for the yellow cab company, and to Deb's point, they publish that there's a flat rate or a certain rate per mile or per minute or whatever it is, then if I'm driving for that company and I change those terms, I'm misrepresenting the offering of someone who is employing me, trusting me to uphold their reputation and their competitive place in the market. And I think that's unethical.
In other words, you're not a free agent. You're representing a company or an entity. And by going outside their rules of use, that is in some form, perhaps a breach of contract.
Yes.
But so now we've got sort of three gray areas. We've got the legality area, which is not so gray. We have perhaps a breach of contract, and then we have the general ethics. Do any of those violations, some or all, mitigate the passenger's obligation to keep his word?
I see them as unrelated.
Ooh, I see them as conditional, because I think Dave makes a very good point about the driver being the agent, in effect, of his employer, and presumably being compelled by whatever means, to whatever extent, to uphold the standards of the organization that he's representing as its agent. So under those circumstances, if they existed, the driver was arguably unethical for saying it's a $30 fare, but for $100, I'll get you out of this nightmare. And I also accept Dave's point that, you know, there had to have been a price beyond which the passenger wouldn't even have thought about it. But to come back to Deb's point about hostage taking for a moment, if the passenger had not accepted the terms before he got in, and then the driver locked the doors and said, I'm going to whack you $100 to get you home. I mean, to me, that's crystal clear. It's probably also hostage taking. It may also be extortion in the bargain, but we didn't stipulate that, Yonason. So maybe we don't want to take that into consideration.
Well, let me introduce another idea that in many places, there's what's called Good Samaritan laws.
Mm-hmm.
And that means if I see a person who is in a state of danger or potential harm, I actually have a legal obligation to intervene if I'm able to do so. Does that have any relevance here?
Wow. Ethics being the slippery slope that it is, I do think it does, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, I were the cab driver. If I saw this person in distress, in a burning neighborhood, I would be inclined to say, I'll get you out of here. I also would recognize my obligation if, in fact, by either time or mileage, that ride costs $30, I would recognize my obligation to make sure that my employer got the $30. Whether or not I decided to ask that of the passenger or to pay it out of my own pocket, that's another deliberation.
It's interesting. I'll give you a storytelling perspective on this. It's interesting that you chose $100 versus $30 as the fare. I'm reminded of the old Groucho Marx joke where he asks the woman, "Will you sleep with me for $1 million?" And she says, "Of course." And then he says, "Would you sleep with me for $1?" And she says, "What do you think I am?" And he says, we've already established what you are. We're just haggling over the price. And from the standpoint, for me, I go, okay, $100, this guy's a loser. I'm going to pay him his $100 and move on with my life, because it's not worth getting wrapped up in the whole negative energy, the conflict. Had he charged $5,000 and said, "I'll get you out of here, but we're stopping at the ATM machine on the way home." Well, if it's a survival issue, what can you do, right? You've really been almost taken at gunpoint away from a situation where you're at gunpoint, but there's an easier way out. But then you'd be much more inclined. And again, I think if you're going to survive, you might complain, you might call him names, you're going to pay him the money, because what do they say? Broke people make bail every day, right? If this situation is dire enough, you're going to find that money. But it's interesting, $100, like, whatever, you're a loser, bye. Enjoy the $100. Don't forget to look over your shoulder as you walk through life. The $5,000, you're probably going to write down the license plate. You might get an attorney. You're certainly going to wrangle with the cab company, and so on and so forth.
Keep in mind that it's 1977, so $100 then might be close to $500 now, so we're somewhere in the middle.
True.
So I can't help but come from the sales perspective. Sales is the fair exchange of goods or services for an agreed upon compensation. So honestly, my first read of the story was the passenger is wrong because they agreed to the price. The cabbie didn't drive off. They were, if I understand the story correctly, the person got in the car, he said the price, and the passenger agreed. So on that agreement, the passenger was in the wrong, because the passenger could have said, "No way, that's extortion," and gotten out. Or could have negotiated, "All right, if you're going to charge that much, then let's go back to the office because my friend is still there and she's going to need a ride too, so take both of us." You know? So if he's going to negotiate the additional cost, then I'm going to get somebody else in the car, at least.
Deb, this may be a question actually better posed to Yonason, but is it possible to be a pragmatist and an ethicist at the same time? Because you are very pragmatic.
You know, it's a conversation that can come up again and again. There's a very insidious, I believe, phrase or term, situational ethics, which the way it's used essentially means that ethics changes based on the situation. And I would say that is highly dangerous. However, while there may be firm ethical principles, situations do change. And we have to look at all the variables, because grappling with the gray means that we're not dealing with black and white. Black and white's easy. It's when you get into those nuances, those competing values, those shifting elements, as we're talking about here. And that's why often in these kinds of discussions, we're not really trying to come necessarily to a hard and fast conclusion. We're trying to understand how to look at the different angles to understand the whole picture better. Because then when we find ourselves in similar situations, we'll be better equipped to handle them. You made a point, Dave, earlier I'd like to come back to, that the cab driver's lack of ethics now puts the passenger in a situation of questionable ethics. And this is why ethics depends so much on a community and upon a common mindset and a common sense of common core values. Because if we do play fast and loose, it's not just us, it's the people we interact with, that when people perceive a lack of fairness, they more easily rationalize their own lack of ethics.
Mm-hmm. And again, to go back to what you were saying, Dave, I think if I had been the passenger, as I was handing over the $100, I probably would have said, I have no idea how you're going to sleep tonight, but thank you for getting me out of that nightmare. It's just a very strange, at least double-sided situation, because arguably by getting in the cab, I was saved from whatever would have beset me if I had stuck around in the burning, violent neighborhood.
Yeah.
Which doesn't excuse the cab driver, but I accepted the deal. If I question his ethics in doing that, that's one thing, but I agreed to the $100 and he got me out.
Absolutely. I still think, and maybe coming full circle on this idea that what the cab driver did to me is wrong. I might or might not comment on that. I might just decide that it's easier to humor a fool than it is to argue with him and not waste my words on him if he's that kind of person. I do that a lot. Sometimes it's easier to walk away. But a contract signed under duress, agreed to under duress, I think the legal system and probably the cab company would frown on that type of thing, would tend to uphold your case. If whether it's the principle or the money, if you felt like you wanted to take that to the next level, there are people you could complain to and maybe should complain to if it's worth that struggle for you. You'd have every right to do it. You'd probably win. Would that be worth it? For $100, probably not. For $5,000, quite possibly. That's where we get into that other gray area. But this idea that you directly engage the cab driver and you allow his wrongdoing to support your wrongdoing, to me, that's the slippery slope.
You remind me of the line from The Godfather that Al Pacino said, my father got the deal by telling the guy that either his signature or his brains would be on the contract.
One of the things that's particularly gray for me, I would have to say, is the relationship between values in general and market value as determined by conditions. If there were no blackout, if there were no fires in the neighborhood, if there were no looting, et cetera, I mean, that's a whole different thing. There's no way in the world that ride was worth $100. And if some cabbie just decided to ignore whatever the stipulations of his own contract were, or the company for which he worked, and drove by and said, hey, I'll take you home for $100, you would probably send them packing. But the conditions under which that offer were made, I guess, is what makes the whole thing so dicey.
I think there's some.
Go ahead, Deb.
I think there's some supply and demand with the conditions. There probably weren't a lot of cabbies that had an empty cab. So to say no to that $100 ride, can I walk home? Is it a distance that I could actually walk? Is there an alternative? Plus, I'm a woman. The city's dark. And I'm more likely to be in danger if I'm walking alone at night in the dark in New York City, right? So from a female's, single alone female's perspective, all of those thoughts go through my head before I make a decision like that. And then you put on top of it that I got to know the cabbie, that I had his number in Chicago. So I would text him when my plane landed and he would pick me up. And I know the difficulty that they are under in that job. So even though he was under a company, he still owned his own car, had to pay all the expenses. So I'm thinking, okay, this guy is out here. He's really doing me a favor. I don't care how much it costs. I'm going to pay it. So if I agree to pay it and then I renege on that, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So that's another perspective.
And I think the fact that you would be undertaking those considerations as a female is very germane, because Dave and Yonason and I are tough guys. Why come you laugh when I say
Watch out, man.
that?
I sensed a little tongue in cheek there.
Oh, really?
I know Taekwondo, Kung Fu, and 3 other Chinese words. Okay, so we're just about out of time. So in a moment, I'll ask each of you to sum up a final thought. But I would like to share, there is a Talmudic approach to this situation. The case there is that a fellow is fleeing from bandits and he gets to the ferry and he can cross the river and escape from the bandits. And the ferryman tells him, I'll take you across, but I'm going to charge you double. And he agrees to it. And he goes across, and then he tells the ferryman, I'm only going to pay you your regular fare. And the sages say, based on Jewish law, that he is allowed to do that, because the ferryman has an obligation to help a person in need, not to the point where he doesn't get his fare, not to the point where it interferes with his livelihood, but that for him to take advantage of a person in that situation is not only morally, but legally wrong. However, we have many cases of sages who, even when they were 100% in the right, would still honor a word that they had spoken, even though it wasn't legally binding them for them to do so. And so this really is in that gray area, that I may not be legally, perhaps not even ethically bound to pay what I said, but the damage I do to myself by not keeping my word may in fact be more profound than the monetary loss. And again, that goes back to Dave's case. What is the damage of my violating my word? Is it worth $100? Is it worth $5,000? There may be further shades of gray there. So
Can I
so
add
Devin,
one?
yeah, please go ahead.
I like the example of the ferryman, because when you're talking about cab drivers, there's thousands of cab drivers. You probably won't see the same one again, but you don't want to piss off the ferryman, because if you do, you're never getting across that river again. And there are certain little people in life who have a lot of power over us, whether we like to admit that or not. And sometimes you're better off just paying double and giving it to them with a blessing, because even if you walk away upset, then you know you're going to get the best seat across the river next time. Sometimes you just have to take care of the little people.
And that's, that goes back to Mark's point, the clash between ethics and pragmatism. And I think we'll save that kind of further conversation for another day. And Deb, you have a last thought for us?
My last thought is, when I give my word, it's my oath. So if I agreed to pay, I will pay. And breaking my word is more painful than taking the dollars out of my wallet.
Agree.
Excellent. Mark?
Surprisingly enough, the word karma never came up in this conversation. But if I had agreed to the deal and then reneged, I would not be comfortable with my own karma. So I would pay, in which case I still think that the passenger was wrong.
And Dave, final word.
I think that the cabbie would be wrong. He could have obviously said, I got enough gas to get one person out, it can be you, but I'm expecting a big tip. That's it gives you a certain option, right? That's better salesmanship. However, you're compromising your own ethics. If you have a complaint, there are other places to take it beyond the possibility of immediate conflict. I think just going against your word lowers you to the level of the cab driver.
Well said.
The common thread I hear is that we should hold ourselves to a higher standard of ethics than what we demand from others. And while that may cause us some short-term loss, ultimately it may provide us much greater personal gain.
And I would add to that, Yonason, and maybe this is a really fine distinction, but not what we would demand from others, but what we would expect from others. And so that seems to me to be a more powerful position of agency, because I know my expectations of another really don't matter all that much. What really matters to me is what I know to be right and my commitment to doing that.
Yeah, I like that. And I think
Well
that
said.
one of the challenges we've faced in our society today is that there's a tendency to expect more from others than we expect from ourselves. And
Oh.
being willing to turn that around, I think will serve all of us
Mhm.
much better. So thank you all very much. This has been a stimulating, engaging, and enjoyable conversation. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Deb. And thank you, Dave.
Thank
And I
you,
hope,
everyone.
I
Thank
hope you'll
you.
join us. I hope you join us again.
Love to.
Now, if you are a Grappling with the Gray member, please use the community link to participate in a follow-up Q&A and continue discussions. If you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live, where you can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.
Thank you.